Ladies and gents, welcome back. Another interesting day at the inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act. Still waiting for justification for that use of the Emergencies Act, which the inquiry is all about. We have seen cases of justifications for certain grievances that have been political grievances. But yesterday we did have one good testimony that was very factual and fact-based by Pat Morris, an intel officer. And here to talk about some of what happened at the inquiry with me is Keith Wilson. Keith, welcome.
Great to be here.
Thank you for coming. So we had an eventful day. What would your beginning takeaways on this whole situation be?
Well, the morning was political theater. It was almost like watching a soap opera of, Deans, the head of the police board at one point before she got removed, going through all the dirty laundry of her fights with the mayor and how they didn't have a plan and they didn't feel they had enough resources. And it was shameful to watch.
Yeah, I opened the segment with exactly that. Absolutely. But yesterday we had one good, I mean, most of this has been political theater. That's from my opinion anyway. But we had Pat Morris come in and he gave his testimony being factual, and he seemed very professional in what he was doing. I found it refreshing, to be honest, and got into one point that I had stressed before, and I'd been stressing for some time now, talking about the Freedom Convoy and the media. He said that the media was making objective assertions, he said, sensationalized and exacerbated the conflict. What?
Well, yeah, I mean, his job is to deal with intel, real actionable data, right? Mm-hmm. So he's collecting the information from their undercover, from their digital intercepts, the social media, all of their officers on the ground. And he was clearly frustrated by the hyperbole, and he even used that word at one point in his testimony, that the legacy media was causing, and this hyping up of political spin and media spin, and didn't feel it was helpful at all to an accurate assessment of the situation as to what was really happening with the convoy.
Yeah, it was amazing because the whole reason, and Keith, I know you can see you suffering. You had a cold recently, making it through. Total champ, absolutely. But throughout this whole thing, the media was making up spin, coming up with ideas, and conjecture from people like me who were covering the story and looking at what was happening on the ground. We saw often that the media would say certain things. The police then would go with stories from the media, and then the politicians would reiterate those stories, and it would become this echo chamber of how else do you put it, but lies. Now, Jim Watson, in his testimony, mentioned that he did use the media as intel in his assessment of the situation.
He did. And interestingly enough, when we were dealing with GoFundMe in the early days after I arrived on the 2nd of February in Ottawa, GoFundMe was talking to the politicians and the police who had based their information on news stories. It was just completely circular. There was nothing at the start of it. And then, of course, GoFundMe's decision became a news story in its own right, which perpetuated all these myths. So it was so refreshing but almost alarming, I guess, to have the senior intelligence officer for the Ontario Provincial Police testify under oath today that behind it all, there was no evidence of violent extremism. There was no evidence of guns. There was no evidence of acts of sabotage. There was no evidence of acts of threat to government. Lead counsel for our team, Brendan Miller, who's just doing a spectacular job. Some people have said, I thought you were going to be lead counsel, Wilson. And I said, well, you know what? I found someone better. And that's why Brendan is where he is. And he's staying there. He literally, Brendan, went through the elements that are legally required under the Act for the government to strip you of your rights, intrude into provincial jurisdiction, and use the nuclear weapon of statutory tools called the Emergencies Act. And there's 5 elements to it. And Brendan walked him methodically through each one and got him to confirm. You mentioned in your opening, Clyde, that to this point, no one's brought forward evidence of the criteria being met. Well, what we had today with this witness, the senior intelligence officer for the OPP, is his confirming that there was no evidence of these requirements being met, that he testified positively by saying he reviewed all the evidence and there was no evidence of attempts of sabotage. There was no evidence that there was going to be an attempt to overthrow the government. There was no evidence that this was a group of violent extremists and so on. So the government's in a bad place. I think we all know what happened here. The thin, weak personality of our prime minister. He could not stomach hardworking, blue-collar, average Canadians of all backgrounds coming to his capital city and calling him out on his government's overreach. Remember, a lot of people don't understand this because I'm also legal counsel to the former Premier Brian Peckford on the travel mandate challenge, as you know. The other G7 countries in January and February, when tens of thousands of Canadians were protesting in Ottawa, didn't have a vaccine mandate to travel in their countries. Canada was an anomaly. Okay? Like, that's not something that was common. The Americans never did it to their citizens, nor did the other G7 countries. So Canadians called out this prime minister for his tyrannical behavior. And rather than sitting down and meeting with the truckers and trying to open a dialogue like he's done with other protesters, he decided that he was going to, throw his petulant child temper tantrum, and he was going to show us. He was going to show Canadians that we're standing for the Charter and the rule of law, and he was going to use the most extreme measures that he could. And there's nothing more extreme in law than the Emergencies Act. It allowed him to force the chartered banks all banks to freeze bank accounts, to deny Canadians of banking services, to seek the cancellation of insurance policies, whether it's home insurance, fire insurance, business insurance, automobile insurance, or life insurance. It's just outrageous what he did. And he had also gave him the ability to intervene in provincial jurisdictions. So we are only day 4, my friend, into 38 days of evidence. We're only day 4. Day 4. You've 38 days of evidence,
and you've already nailed off all the stuff that I wanted to hit in this segment. But that opened up one big question that I have lingering. So I had a lot of things that I wanted to say, but you nailed it. You nailed it all before I could get it out of my mouth.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. The one thing that is lingering on everybody's minds is what happens when they fail. What happens when the government fails to produce the evidence, the justification for the Emergencies Act? Is it like every other thing that we've seen with the Prime Minister when it comes to ethics commissions? He just walks away, nothing happens. What is the actual implications of this?
Well, it could be. So normally, all the Act says, Section 63 of the Emergency Act says, that if the government invokes it, within a year, a commission inquiry has to occur, and it has to report. And it has to report on whether or not it was justified. So I believe the drafters of that provision expected that if a report comes out from the commissioner after the inquiry that says it wasn't justified, that the government would fall, that the government would resign. But that's implying an ethical standard that is clearly absent from Mr. Trudeau and his fellow high school, council members, because that's certainly the maturity at which they behave.
Well, and that's what's coming out. People
So,
just are looking at politicians. We used to look at like them as the aristocracy, and now it's worse than we'd imagined as this is all unfolding.
well, it is. It's spectacular what's been coming out in these few days, and embarrassingly so. And you ask yourself, where are the adults? Because they're clearly not in the cabinet. No, I'm serious. I mean, you laugh because it resonates with you, right?
Right.
And we've had that discussion. And even when you look at how, the mayor's chief of staff and the Serge and Steve Kay, the city manager, with whom Tom Marazzo, myself, and Eva Chipiak, we had, the first meetings and opened up the dialogue. And, it was really weird for me to be sitting there and listening to them talking about me. So were you in the room with Mr. Wilson? And did Mr. Wilson say this? And did Mr. Wilson say that? And, was Mr. Wilson dealing in good faith? Yes, he was a straight shooter, and they're saying all these nice things about us. And, we were just trying to be the adults in the room and keep the lid on the event and allow its goals to be achieved, which was to shine a light on people's ability to peacefully protest and peacefully dissent and peacefully expose a government's tyrannical activity. But, it's turning out like the adults in the room were the convoy protesters and Canadians who came to Ottawa. And we're now realizing the absolute chaos behind the scenes, the infighting, the resignations, the firings, the voting off of boards, the blaming. It's spectacular how immature and how poorly our political leadership behaved so far from the evidence.
Amazing. It's amazing to me how it's panned out. And I want to thank you for joining me today, Keith. And we'll definitely have you back to talk more about this. I could talk to you all night, actually. I could, but for the sake of brevity and getting this out there, I'm going to cut it here. And thank you so much.
Well, first, let me say this, especially to your listeners, because I shared with you, I'm a closet fan. I've been a fan of yours since your early days. So thank you for what you do. It's guys like you that inspired me to put my career and reputation on the line and come to Ottawa and do what I've been doing. So thank you. And thank your listeners for tuning in and try and stay on top of what's really going on out here.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. They say don't meet your heroes, but I think Keith's the exception. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Tune in. I wasn't expecting that finisher. But leave a comment, as always, in the description down below. Let me know what you think of this situation, the inquiry as a whole. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, I think Keith just gave you a reason to. We'll see you in the next one. Keep on trucking.